The blizzard hit without mercy. Outside Red Hollow, Montana was dying. Ranch by ranch, family by family, silently swallowed by ice and sickness. Inside one small house, a woman nobody had ever respected stood at her cellar door, lantern trembling in her hand, staring down at the only thing standing between 400 people in a mass grave. They had laughed at her, ignored her, called her obsessive, foolish, fat. Now every hungry child, every fever-broken rancher, every desperate mother in this frozen valley needed exactly what Savannah Brooks had spent years quietly building, and absolutely nobody saw it coming. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. This one will stay with you. Red Hollow, Montana. Autumn, 1887. The first thing most people noticed about Savannah Brooks was her size. The second thing, if they bothered to look that long, was her hands. They were always moving, kneading, chopping, stirring, pressing. Rough at the knuckles, stained faintly at the fingertips with blackberry and beet, calloused in the places that only come from years of real, unrelenting work. If you watch those hands long enough, you might have started to understand something about the woman they belonged to. But in Red Hollow, Montana, in the autumn of 1887, very few people watched long enough. What they saw instead was a large woman waddling between the market stalls on a Saturday morning, her wicker basket already overflowing before most families had finished their coffee. They saw her loading jars into her wagon with a quiet, focused determination that struck the townspeople as either admirable in a sad kind of way or simply peculiar, depending on who you asked. They saw a woman who sweated through her blouse before noon, who breathed harder on the hills, who never quite fit the ideal that Red Hollow's respectable wives seemed to effortlessly occupy. They did not see Savannah Brooks. Not really. She had grown up 40 miles east, in a smaller settlement called Birch Creek, the daughter of a woman who preserved everything: berries, venison, wild onion, even the fat from butchered hogs, because she understood, bone deep, that the frontier did not forgive the unprepared. Savannah's mother, Eleanor, had lived through 2 brutal winters that killed neighbors and livestock indiscriminately, and she had emerged from both with her children fed and her cellar stocked, and she had never once considered this luck. It was work. It was foresight. It was the quiet, stubborn refusal to let the land win. Eleanor taught Savannah everything she knew. How to read the sky in late August when the cloud formation shifted and the birds moved differently. How to press lard into stone crocks and seal them with cloth and wax. How to brew a broth so dense with marrow and wild herbs that a single cup could pull a feverish child back from the edge of something terrible. How to salt, smoke, dry, pickle, and ferment in quantities that other women considered excessive and Eleanor considered minimum. The neighbors will always think you're crazy until they're knocking on your door in January, Eleanor used to say, her voice dry and matter-of-fact, never bitter. Let them think it. Just keep your cellar full. Savannah kept her cellar full. She had married Cole Mercer at 19, which was late by Red Hollow's standards, and she had understood even then that Cole was not marrying her for the reasons men in dime novels married women. He was not dazzled by her. He was practical. A rancher who needed a capable wife, someone who could manage a household, someone who would not shrink at the work. Savannah fit that description. She was efficient, tireless, and she didn't complain. Cole appreciated these qualities the way a man appreciates a good fence post, reliably, without sentiment. He was not cruel to her. That was important to understand. Cole Mercer was not a villain. He was a man of his era, hardened by land and weather, who expressed affection through action rather than words, and who had simply never developed the habit of looking closely at the woman he lived with. He noticed when supper wasn't ready. He did not notice when Savannah had been on her feet for 14 hours. He understood, in a vague way, that she worked hard. He did not understand why she worked the way she did, or what it meant, or what she was quietly building down in that cellar that smelled of vinegar and wood smoke and dried thyme. "You bought more jars," he said one September evening, stepping around a crate of empty mason jars in the kitchen doorway. He was tired from the range, dust still thick on his collar, and his tone carried the particular exhaustion that makes everything sound like an accusation. 48, Savannah said without looking up from the pot she was stirring. Henderson's was selling them at a discount. His supplier overproduced. Savannah, Cole sat down heavily at the table. We have more jars in that cellar than we could fill in 10 years. We'll fill them. With what? She glanced at him then, just briefly, just long enough for him to see something quiet and certain in her expression that he couldn't quite name. Whatever comes, she said, and she went back to stirring. Cole stared at her back for a moment, then shook his head, reached for his coffee, and said nothing more. This was more or less the shape of their marriage. Red Hollow. In the autumn of 1887 was the kind of town that believed in itself. It had a population of 412, a functioning general store, a one-room schoolhouse that was nearly always too cold, a livery stable that doubled as a barbershop on Saturdays, a small clinic operated by Dr. Theodore Hale, and a saloon called the Iron Mule that was the center of most social activity that the church wouldn't sanction. The ranchers were prosperous by frontier standards. The harvest that year had been good. Grain stores were adequate, cattle were fat, and there was a general mood of cautious optimism that sometimes, on a clear autumn day, edged toward genuine contentment. The townspeople had a social architecture as rigid as anything you'd find in a city back east, even if they wouldn't have recognized it as such. There were the families who mattered, the Caldwells, who owned the largest spread in the valley, the Prestons, whose patriarch sat on the town council, the Hargroves, who ran the general store and therefore knew everyone's business and everyone's debt. And then there were people like Savannah, wives of mid-tier ranchers, women who were present at every gathering and invisible at all of them, noticed only when they failed to perform some expected social function. Savannah had long since stopped trying to be noticed. She attended the women's sewing circle on Thursday afternoons, mostly because Eleanor had impressed upon her the value of community connection, even when the community didn't particularly value you. She sat in the back, stitched with the focused efficiency she brought to everything, and listened. The other women talked about their husbands, their children, the latest news from the telegraph office, the price of calico from Henderson's store. Occasionally someone would say something to Savannah, usually asking her to pass a spool of thread or commenting on the weather, and she would respond pleasantly and then return to her listening. It was at the sewing circle that she first heard the name that would haunt Red Hollow all winter. "My cousin's settlement," said Dora Caldwell one October afternoon, setting down her embroidery hoop with a delicate frown. "Over in Bitterroot Ridge. They've had some kind of sickness move through. 3 families affected already?" "What kind of sickness?" asked Martha Preston, leaning forward. Something respiratory from what the telegram said. Fever, weakness, terrible cough. Children hit the hardest. Dora shook her head. "They've lost 2 already. A boy of 6 and a girl not yet 4. The room went quiet for a moment with the particular reverence people pay to the deaths of children. "That's a frontier cough," said old Agnes Wheeler, who was 73 and had outlived 2 husbands and claimed to have survived more disasters than any other living resident of Red Hollow. "Seen it before. Moves fast when it gets in a community. Very fast." "Do they know where it started?" someone asked. "Drifters, most likely," said Dora. "Someone passing through who was already sick." The conversation moved on, to the price of wool, to someone's daughter's upcoming wedding, and Savannah sat very still in the back of the room, her needle unmoving, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. Bitterroot Ridge. That was 40 miles northwest, 4 days' ride in summer. In winter, with a bad storm, it might as well be 400 miles. She went home that evening and spent 3 hours in her cellar, taking inventory by lamplight, moving jars, rearranging shelves, making calculations in a small leather notebook she kept on the top shelf next to the dried chamomile. Cole found her down there when he came in for supper and stood at the top of the cellar stairs, looking down with the expression he reserved for things he didn't understand and didn't care to. "Supper's not ready yet," Savannah said, without looking up. "I can see that." A pause. "What are you doing?" "Counting." "Savannah, 30 minutes, Cole. Supper in 30 minutes. He went back inside. She kept counting. October in Red Hollow was gold and rust, and the smell of wood smoke from every chimney. The aspens along the creek road dropped their leaves in sudden curtains of yellow when the wind came down from the north, and the mornings arrived with frost that crackled under boot heels and made the horses restless. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful just before they turn dangerous, all color and stillness, the land breathing in before it held its breath. Savannah moved through October like a woman in the middle of something urgent that no one else could see. She purchased 12 more pounds of dried beans from Henderson's store, drawing a raised eyebrow from Pete Henderson behind the counter. "You planning to feed an army, Mrs. Mercer?" "Possibly," she said, and counted out her coins. She traded 2 jars of her blackberry preserve for a large quantity of dried sage and yarrow from old Agnes Wheeler, who grew herbs in a surprisingly lush kitchen garden and seemed to understand without being told why Savannah wanted them. "You heard about Bitterroot Ridge," Agnes said. It wasn't a question. "I did." Agnes studied her for a moment with eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. "You're preparing." "I'm always preparing." "Others aren't." "I know." Agnes wrapped the herbs in cloth without another word and handed them over. Then she reached back and added a small bundle of dried elderberry without being asked. "Take this too, for the fever if it comes." Savannah took it. "Thank you, Agnes." "Don't thank me." Agnes's voice was rough but not unkind. "Just use it right." She added to her cellar every week, quietly and without announcement. More salt, more lard, more dried meat, carefully wrapped and hung. More jars of preserved vegetables, carrots, parsnips, green beans, corn, tomatoes, sealed so perfectly that Cole, on the one occasion he descended to help her move a heavy crate, had marveled involuntarily at the precision of the work before catching himself and saying nothing complimentary. She brewed what she called her winter broth, a long-simmered reduction of bones, onion, dried herbs, and a particular combination of roots she had learned from her mother, poured into crocks and sealed while still hot, cooling into a dense, gelatinous concentrate that would keep through the coldest months and, diluted with hot water, could constitute a complete and nourishing meal for someone too weak to eat solid food. She stacked firewood along the back wall of the cellar, in addition to the woodpile behind the house. Cole asked about this specifically. "We have a woodpile," he said. "Yes." "A big woodpile." "Yes." She set another log in place. "And now we have more." "Savannah." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she had learned meant he was trying to be patient. "Can you explain to me why it's going to be a hard winter, Cole?" "You don't know that." She looked at him steadily. "I feel it in the way the animals are moving. The squirrels started caching in August this year, 2 weeks early. The geese flew south before the first frost. Agnes Wheeler's joints have been giving her trouble since September, and that woman's joints have never been wrong about a winter." She paused. "I know you think I'm being foolish." "I didn't say you were thinking it." A long silence. Cole looked at the stacked wood, at the lined shelves, at his wife standing in the golden lamplight with sawdust on her apron and absolute certainty in her eyes. "I'll bring you more wood tomorrow," he said finally. It was the closest he came, that autumn, to saying you might be right. November arrived like a warning. The temperature dropped sharply in the first week, 2 full weeks earlier than the oldest residents could remember. A light snow fell on the 8th of November and didn't melt, which was unusual. By the 15th, the creek at the edge of town had developed a skin of ice thin enough to see through, but thick enough to make the horses nervous at the crossing. Savannah worked faster. She was at the market before anyone else each Saturday morning, buying the last of the season's root vegetables, filling gaps in her stores with a focused urgency that she no longer tried to disguise. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She moved between the stalls with her basket and her list, quiet and purposeful. And if she heard someone say something unkind, and she did, more than once, she let it pass through her like cold water and kept moving. "That Mercer woman," she heard Clara Hargrove say one Saturday to someone whose voice she didn't recognize. "I swear she's bought half the inventory in this town. I don't know what she thinks she's doing with it all." "Hoarding," the other voice said. "Some women are like that. Anxiety, probably. Makes them feel better to have things." Savannah set a jar of molasses in her basket and moved to the next stall. Let them talk, she thought. Just keep your cellar full. It was on the 23rd of November, a gray Thursday that smelled of iron and coming snow, that the first telegram arrived from Bitterroot Ridge. The epidemic had exploded. 12 dead in 3 weeks. The settlement's doctor was himself bedridden. Families were quarantining, but the illness moved faster than the quarantine. They were out of medicine, low on food, overwhelmed. The telegram operator, young Billy Ferris, read it aloud to the small crowd that gathered at the telegraph office, and the mood in Red Hollow shifted in the way that moods shift when something abstract becomes suddenly, undeniably real. "That's only 40 miles, said Walter Caldwell. 40 miles in November, said Dr. Theodore Hale, who was 34 in earnest and had received his medical training in Philadelphia, where the winters were nothing like this. In a blizzard, this town is isolated, completely isolated. "It won't reach us," said someone in the crowd. "We're careful people." "Bitterroot Ridge was careful people," said Agnes Wheeler from the edge of the group, in the dry tone of someone who has watched careful people die before and found it instructive. The crowd murmured. There was a general agreement to be watchful, to report any illness to Dr. Hale immediately, to keep children indoors. The council would meet, precautions would be taken. The usual words of order and reassurance were spoken by the people whose job it was to speak them, and gradually the crowd dispersed back to their ordinary November afternoon. Savannah stood on the boardwalk outside the telegraph office for a long moment after the others had gone, the cold air pressing against her face, and looked north toward the mountains where the clouds were building dark and enormous along the ridge. She went home. She went down to the cellar. She lit her lamp, opened her leather notebook, and spent 2 hours revising her calculations. Not for herself and Cole alone, but for a number she'd been thinking about since October, and now wrote down clearly, for the first time, in her careful handwriting, 412. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started work. The snow came the first week of December. It came the way the worst storms come, not with drama at first, but quietly, steadily, building while people slept and revealing its full intention only in the morning when they opened their doors and found the world had been rewritten overnight. By the second day, the roads were difficult. By the fourth day, they were impassable. By the end of the first week, Red Hollow, Montana, existed as its own small island of cold and lamplight, cut off from everything outside its valley, dependent entirely on what it had stored and what it could endure. And then, on the 9th of December, Hank Boyle's youngest boy stopped eating. The Boyle Ranch was the northernmost in the valley, closest to the mountain pass, closest to wherever the illness had come from. Little Thomas Boyle was 7 years old, healthy in October, and now lay in his bed with a fever that would not break, a chest that rattled when he breathed, and eyes that had gone dull in the particular way that frightened mothers more than any specific symptom. His mother, Ruth Boyle, saddled her horse through knee-deep snow and rode to Dr. Hale's clinic and described what she was seeing, and Dr. Hale went quiet in a way that was worse than anything he might have said. He rode out to the Boyle Ranch in the early afternoon, examined the boy, and rode back to his clinic with the particular expression of a man who is trying very hard not to let what he is thinking show on his face. 2 days later, the Boyle Ranch's hired hand fell sick. 2 days after that, a family on the adjacent property. Red Hollow held its breath. Savannah did not hold hers. On the morning of the 12th of December, while the snow came down in curtains so thick you couldn't see the barn from the house, she rose before dawn, went down to the cellar, selected 6 crocks of winter broth, 2 jars of dried elderberry, a package of dried herbs, and the remainder of her molasses, which she used for energy broths when nothing else was available, and loaded them carefully into a wooden crate. Then she put on her coat, her heaviest scarf, and her boots, and she went out into the storm. Cole found the note she left on the kitchen table when he came down for breakfast. Gone to the Boyle place. There's porridge on the stove. Don't let the kitchen fire go out. S. He stood in the kitchen in his stocking feet, holding the note, and stared at it for a long moment. Outside, the wind drove snow against the window glass with a sound like thrown gravel. Damn it, Savannah, he said quietly to the empty room. But he let the kitchen fire burn. The road to the Boyle Ranch was not a road anymore. It was a suggestion, a slightly different quality of whiteness where the packed earth should have been, visible only if you had walked it enough times to feel it under your feet through 6 inches of snow. Savannah had not walked it that many times. She followed the fence line when she could, kept the mountains on her left, and moved slowly, steadily, the crate in her arms growing heavier with each step. She fell twice. The second time she went down hard on her knees and stayed there for a moment, breathing in controlled bursts, the cold air burning in her lungs, the crate pressed to her chest. The snow was coming sideways. She could not see more than 20 feet in any direction. Get up, she told herself, in exactly her mother's voice. Thomas Boyle is 7 years old, and he hasn't eaten in 3 days. Get up. She got up. She reached the Boyle Ranch 40 minutes later and knocked on the door with a hand she could no longer feel. Ruth Boyle opened it. She had the face of a woman who had not slept in 4 days and was operating on something beyond sleep, the stripped-down animal determination of a mother who was not yet ready to lose her child. She looked at Savannah. She looked at the crate. She looked back at Savannah. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, and her voice cracked. "How did you—" "It's a blizzard out there." "I know." Savannah stepped inside. "Let me see him." Thomas Boyle lay in the back bedroom, small under heavy quilts, his breath coming in shallow, uneven pulls. His fever had climbed. His lips were dry. He had not eaten. Savannah set down her crate, opened one of the crocks of broth, and poured a portion into the small pot Ruth had on the stove. She added elderberry, a pinch of dried thyme, a careful measure of molasses for energy and palatability. "This won't be medicine," she told Ruth plainly. "I'm not a doctor, but a sick body needs warmth and nourishment, and it needs them together, and I know how to do that." Ruth said nothing. She watched. The broth warmed. Savannah took it to the boy's bedside, propped him up with practiced gentleness, and spooned it into him slowly, patiently, the way her mother had done for her during her own childhood fevers. A little at a time, never rushing, watching for the swallow reflex, encouraging without pressure. Thomas drank 3 spoonfuls, then 5. Then he turned his face away and slept, not the restless, fever-thrashing sleep of before, but something quieter and deeper. Ruth Boyle sat in his chair in the corner of the room and pressed her hands over her face and shook with quiet, exhausted tears. Savannah put her hand briefly on the woman's shoulder. Then she picked up the remaining crocks, left instructions for the hired hand and the neighboring family, and walked back out into the storm. She had 3 more stops to make before dark. That night, Cole was waiting up when she came home. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee untouched and an expression she had never quite seen on him before. Something between anger and something else he didn't have a name for. She came through the door trailing snow, her face bitten red by the cold, her boots soaked through, the empty crate under her arm. "You could have died out there," he said. "I didn't. You walked to the Boyle place in a blizzard. And the Gunther place and the Simmons property." She set the crate down and began unwinding her scarf. "Thomas Boyle ate today. So did the Gunther girl." A long silence. "Savannah, don't, Cole." Her voice was quiet but not gentle. There was steel in it, the kind of steel that comes not from anger but from absolute clarity. "I know what you're going to say. I know what half this town would say. But that boy ate today. And tomorrow I'm going back." Cole looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes and didn't look away. "I'll hitch the horse," he said finally. She blinked. "What?" "Tomorrow. I'll hitch the horse and drive you. It's faster than walking." He stood up, carried his cold coffee to the wash basin. "You'll need more room for the supplies." She stood very still in the kitchen doorway, snow melting in her hair, and felt something move in her chest that she didn't try to name. "Thank you," she said quietly. Cole nodded once, briskly, with his back to her, the way he did when something had moved him that he didn't want to show. "Go warm up," he said. "Supper's on the stove. I kept the fire." Outside, the blizzard hammered Red Hollow without mercy. Inside Savannah Brooks's cellar, 400 jars sat in organized rows on hand-built shelves, each one sealed and labeled in careful handwriting, each one the product of years of quiet, purposeful, unrecognized work. The town that had never chosen her was about to need every single one of them, and Savannah, the large, awkward, obsessive woman who bought too many jars and cooked too much broth and worried too much about winters that hadn't come yet, was going to feed them all. She just didn't know yet how hard the fight was going to be before she got the chance. Cole drove her the next morning in the gray, muffled silence that follows a night of heavy snowfall, the horse picking its way carefully through drifts that had reshaped the landscape into something unfamiliar and vaguely threatening. Savannah sat beside him on the wagon bench, with 3 crates wedged between her feet and her breath coming in small white clouds, watching the white fields slide past and counting in her head. How many crocks? How many families? How many days the stores could stretch if she rationed carefully? She had not slept well, not because of the cold or the wind still rattling the window glass, but because she had lain awake doing the arithmetic that nobody else in Red Hollow seemed to be doing. If the illness moved the way illness moved, the way she had heard it described from Bitterroot Ridge, jumping from household to household through shared air and shared water and the simple proximity of frightened people, then the Boyle Ranch would not be the last. The Gunther place would not be the last. She had 3 crocks of broth left from yesterday's run, a crate of preserved vegetables, and 2 jars of elderberry concentrate. It was, in the language her mother had taught her, a beginning. What she needed was a plan. Thomas Boyle's fever broke this morning, Cole said without looking at her. She turned. Who told you? Ran into Hank Boyle at the well before you were up. He said the boy ate real food at breakfast. Half a bowl of porridge. Cole kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set in the way it got when something had affected him that he wasn't prepared to discuss. Said Ruth told him what you brought, the broth. Savannah said nothing. She looked back at the white fields. He cried, Cole said. Hank Boyle, standing there at the well in the snow. I've known that man 15 years, and I've never seen him. He stopped, cleared his throat. Anyway, Savannah agreed quietly, and they rode the rest of the way in silence that felt different than it had before. The Gunther farm told a harder story. When Savannah knocked and stepped inside, she found not 2 sick, but 4. Emil Gunther himself had gone down overnight, and his wife, Clara, was moving between sickbeds with the hollow efficiency of someone running on nothing but fear. The 2 children, a girl of 9 and a boy of 12, lay in the back room with fevers that had climbed since yesterday. Clara looked at Savannah with red-rimmed eyes and said, with terrible simplicity, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do for them. Then let me do it, Savannah said, and she took off her coat and got to work. She reheated broth on the Gunther's stove, fed both children in the careful, patient way she had learned by watching her mother and then by doing it herself. And while the second pot warmed, she sat with Clara at the kitchen table and spoke to her in the direct, practical tone she used when there was no time for softness, but kindness still mattered. You have to eat too, Savannah told her. A sick household needs one person who is well enough to run it, and that person is you. So eat something and then sleep for 3 hours, and I will stay until you wake up. Clara stared at her. You'd stay? I'll stay. Clara ate, she slept. Savannah tended the sick beds for 4 hours, not 3. And when Clara woke, she looked slightly more like herself and slightly less like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff. Mrs. Mercer, Clara said, watching Savannah rewrap the children in fresh quilts. Why are you doing this? We haven't always been... She fumbled with the words in the way people do when they're trying to apologize without precisely naming the thing they've done. Savannah understood. The Gunthers had not been unkind to her, exactly. They had simply been the sort of people who looked through her at social gatherings, who didn't include her in conversations, who had made her feel, on more occasions than she could count, that she occupied some lesser category of personhood in Red Hollow. Clara knew this. Her stumbling sentence proved it. It doesn't matter, Savannah said. And she meant it, not in the wounded way of someone swallowing an injury, but in the plain, practical way of someone who has decided that some things are simply not relevant to the task at hand. Your children are sick. That's what matters. She left the Gunthers with 2 full crocks, an instruction she made Clara repeat back to her. Then she climbed back into the wagon where Cole was waiting, took the reins from him without comment, and turned the horse toward the Simmons property. By the time they got home that evening, the snow had started again. Savannah went down to the cellar alone. She stood with her lamp raised and looked at her shelves, really looked, the way she had been doing the arithmetic in her head all day. And for the first time since October, she felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature. It wasn't enough. What she had was generous by any ordinary standard, by the standard of what was coming, the standard she could feel gathering in the north wind and the darkening sky and the pattern of illness that was spreading exactly as she had feared. It was not enough. Not if half the town fell sick. Not if the winter ran long, which her bones and the squirrels and Agnes Wheeler's joints all agreed it would. She sat down on the bottom cellar step and held her lamp and thought for a very long time. Then she went back upstairs, sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, and began writing a different kind of list. Cole came in while she was writing, He poured himself coffee, stood at the stove for a moment, and then sat down across from her. He looked at the list. He didn't say anything immediately, which meant he was being careful. "What is that?" he asked finally. "Every family in Red Hollow," she said, "and what I think they have in storage based on what I know about their habits and what I've seen at the market." She turned the notebook so he could read it. "And here," she pointed to a second column, "what they'll need if the illness runs 8 weeks, which is what Bitterroot Ridge is looking at." Cole studied the page for a long moment. She watched him read it. She watched the moment when the numbers stopped being abstract and became real, when the columns of names and estimates resolved into the faces of people he knew, people he drank with at the Iron Mule, people whose children went to school with the children of his ranch hands. "We don't have enough," he said. Not a question. "Not alone," she said. "But there are families in this town who have more than they think they'll need." The Caldwell's grain store alone could feed 30 people for 2 months if it was managed properly. Henderson has inventory in his back room that he's holding for spring prices. Old Agnes Wheeler has herb stores that could treat half the respiratory cases in town if someone knew how to use them properly. She tapped the notebook. "It's not about what any one family has. It's about what the town has." Together, Cole looked at her for a long moment. "And who's going to convince Walter Caldwell to open his grain store for the whole valley?" Savannah's expression didn't change. "I'll worry about that when we get there." He looked at his wife, really looked at her, the way he had not looked at her in a long time, maybe ever, and said slowly, "You've been planning this since October, haven't you?" "Since August," she said, "when I first heard about the settlements north of the pass." The silence that followed was long and had a texture to it. The texture of a man reassessing something he thought he understood and discovering he'd been completely wrong about it. "What do you need me to do?" Cole said finally. She slid the notebook across the table. "Start with page 3. That's the list of ranchers who might listen to you before they'd listen to me." He picked it up without another word. Savannah went to the stove and put on more broth. The next 3 days were the calm before the storm broke completely open. Savannah drove the delivery route every morning, building it efficiently. Boyle Ranch first, then Gunther, then Simmons, then the 2 new families who'd reported symptoms to Dr. Hale on the 14th of December, the Reeves family on the East Ridge, and the Palmers, whose homestead sat at the bottom of the valley where the cold air pooled and the frost came hardest. She moved with the systematic focus of someone running a small operation, which was exactly what she was doing. She kept her records in her notebook. She tracked who was improving and who was not. She adjusted the broth formulas based on what she observed. More ginger for the deepest chest congestion, more marrow for the patients who were too weak to hold their heads up, a stronger elderberry reduction for the children whose fevers climbed fastest. Dr. Hale appeared at her door on the 15th. He was a tall man with an honest face and an expression that currently held more worry than it had room for. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands. "I need to talk to you." "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He sat at her kitchen table and said without preamble, because he was that kind of man, "3 of the 5 families you've been visiting are showing significant improvement. Thomas Boyle's fever is gone entirely. The Reeves girl's chest has cleared enough that she's sleeping through the night." He paused. "I don't know exactly what you're doing, but I want to know." She told him. She walked him through the broth formula, the marrow base, the herbs, the elderberry, the proportions. In the same clear, methodical way she kept her records. She showed him the notebook, the observations, the adjustments she had made based on patient response. He listened with the careful attention of a man whose pride was entirely secondary to his interest in things that worked. "This isn't medicine," she said again, as she had said to Ruth Boyle. "I want to be clear about that." "No," he agreed, "but it's nourishment and warmth administered consistently, which is more than half of what medicine does in cases like this." He looked up from the notebook. "Mrs. Mercer, how much do you have? In your stores?" She told him that too. She showed him the cellar. He stood in the lamplight looking at the shelves with an expression that was equal parts relief and alarm. Relief because it was more than he'd expected. Alarm because he was already doing the same arithmetic she had done 3 nights ago. "It's not enough," he said. "Not alone," she said, in exactly the same tone she'd used with Cole. But I have a plan. He looked at her steadily. Tell me. She told him about the list. The Caldwell's Grain, Henderson's back room, Agnes Wheeler's herb stores. The possibility of a coordinated distribution. Not charity, not a handout, but a genuine community supply network, run efficiently, managed carefully, with records kept and resources tracked. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'll need someone the town council respects to bring this to the council." "I know. They won't listen to—" He stopped himself. "To me," she finished without rancor. "I know that too." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I was going to say they won't listen to anyone they see as an outsider to the crisis. They need to understand the medical dimension before they'll take the resource question seriously." "Then that's your part," Savannah said. "Give them the medical dimension. I'll handle the resources." Hale looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has just realized he has been sitting across from a considerably more capable person than he initially assumed. "You've thought all of this through," he said. "Since August," she said again. He put on his hat. "I'll speak to the council tomorrow morning." The council met on the 16th of December in the back room of Henderson's store, which was the largest heated space in town apart from the Iron Mule and was considered more appropriate for official business. Savannah was not invited. She sat at home and boiled broth and waited. Cole came back in the early afternoon with snow on his shoulders and an unreadable expression. "Well," she said. "Hale made his case," Cole said, pouring himself coffee. "Scared them, frankly. The man has a gift for presenting facts without drama that somehow makes everything more frightening." "And?" "And they agreed there's a problem." He sat down. "They're less agreed on the solution." "Walter Caldwell," Savannah said. Cole looked at her. "How did you know?" "Because Walter Caldwell has the most to give and the most to lose, and he's spent his whole life being the most important man in this valley, and being asked to open his grain store to people he sees as beneath him is going to feel like being asked to give away the thing that makes him important." She said it without heat, without bitterness. Just the flat, accurate assessment of someone who has spent years observing people while they pretended she wasn't there. "What did he say?" "He said he'd give 50 pounds of grain from his personal store as a donation." Savannah closed her eyes for a single breath. 50 pounds. "Yes. Walter Caldwell has 2,000 pounds of grain in that store." "Yes." She opened her eyes. "Then I need to talk to Walter Caldwell." Cole put down his coffee very carefully. "Savannah, not at the council, not officially." She was already reaching for her coat. "Alone, at his house, tonight." "He won't?" "He'll see me," she said, "because I'm going to send word ahead that I want to talk to him about his daughter." Cole went still. "Margaret? She's not—" "She hasn't been reported sick." "She hasn't been reported," Savannah said quietly. "That's not the same thing." She had seen Margaret Caldwell 3 days ago. Not as a patient, but in passing, on the road between 2 sick houses. And she had noticed what no one else had apparently noticed. The girl's color, the slight drag in her step, the way she'd pulled her coat tight against a chill that wasn't entirely explained by the temperature. Margaret Caldwell was 22 and too proud to report herself sick when her father was the most important man in Red Hollow, and illness was something that happened to other families. Walter Caldwell's house was the finest in the valley. 2 stories, glass windows, a wood stove in every room. He met Savannah at the door with the particular expression of a man who has spent his entire life being slightly irritated by things he can't quite dismiss, and she was one of those things. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "your note said something about Margaret. May I come in?" He stepped aside without warmth. She went in. Margaret was in the parlor, pretending to read, and Savannah saw immediately that she'd been right. The girl's cheeks were too bright. Her breath was slightly too fast. She held her book with fingers that had the fine tremor of early fever. Savannah sat down across from her without being invited and said, gently, directly, "How long have you been feeling ill?" Margaret glanced at her father. Something shifted in her expression. The brittle dignity of someone who has been pretending too hard for too long. And she said, in a smaller voice than Savannah expected, 4 days. Walter Caldwell said nothing. He stood in the doorway of his own parlor, and Savannah watched the color leave his face in a slow, specific way. the color of a powerful man realizing that his power has no purchase on certain things. Savannah looked at him steadily. She needs broth, rest, and consistent warmth, the same as the Boyle boy, who is recovered, the same as the Gunther children, who are improving. She kept her voice even and without any note of leverage, because this was not about leverage. This was about a sick girl and a frightened father and 400 other people who needed the same care. I have what she needs, Mr. Caldwell, and I have what this town needs, but I can't do it alone, and I won't be able to do it much longer with only my own stores. The fire crackled. The snow whispered against the windows. What do you need from me? Walter Caldwell said. She told him, all of it. The grain, the coordination, the community kitchen she had been quietly sketching in her notebook for 3 weeks. A centralized place where resources could be pooled and managed and food prepared for the sick and the isolated. She told him without apology and without softening it, because Walter Caldwell was a man who respected directness even when he didn't respect the person delivering it. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both of them practical and good, and she answered them. Then he said, if I do this, if I commit the grain, I want it understood that this is organized, with records, not charity. A community arrangement with the store replenished in spring by proportional contribution. I have a ledger already started, Savannah said. He looked at her for a long, considering moment. Margaret coughed softly from the settee, and he looked at his daughter, and something in his face shifted into something simpler and older than status or pride. All right, he said. On the 17th of December, the temperature dropped to levels that made the older residents go quiet and pull their coats tighter and speak in the careful sentences of people trying not to frighten each other. The storm that had been building in the north came down the mountain pass like something that intended to finish the job the cold had started. By nightfall, drifts had reached the eaves of the shorter outbuildings. The road through the center of town was indistinguishable from the fields on either side. And in 10 separate households across Red Hollow, someone new had fallen sick. Savannah heard it from Dr. Hale, who appeared at her door at 7 in the evening, snow-covered, with the expression of a man whose calculations have just been revised dramatically upward. 10 new cases, he said. In one day. She let him in. She poured him coffee. She took out her notebook and they went through the new names together, mapping households, estimating need, calculating what the current stores could sustain against what the next 2 weeks of illness would require. We need the community kitchen operational before the week is out, Savannah said. If people are trying to care for their sick and isolated households with whatever they have on hand, we're going to lose people. Not because they can't be saved, but because they won't have what they need to be saved. Hale nodded. Henderson offered his storage space on the east side. It's large enough, and there's a stove already installed. I know the space. She was already writing. I'll need 2 things from you, Doctor. I need you to send word to every household that's still healthy, telling them that helping with the community kitchen is the best protection they have against getting sick themselves. And I need you to tell them that Savannah Mercer is running the kitchen. She said it without vanity and without apology. Because if it comes from you, they'll believe it's a medical necessity. If it comes from me alone, half of them will wait to see if someone more respectable takes charge. Hale looked at her across the table, and this time his expression was unambiguous. It was the look of a man who has revised his estimate of another person completely and is not bothering to hide it. Consider it done, he said. What followed was the most brutal week of Savannah's life. She slept in 3-hour intervals, waking before dawn to begin the first broth batches of the day in the large pots she'd moved to Henderson's storage space, which smelled of raw lumber and lamp oil, and now, increasingly, of thyme and marrow, and the deep, meaty warmth of long-simmered bones. Volunteers arrived in dribs and drabs. Cautiously at first, because Red Hollow was a town that did things slowly and by committee, and showing up to help a woman most of them had ignored required a small private recalibration that took time. But they came. The Boyle Ranch sent Ruth, who worked with the ferocious energy of a woman paying a debt she could never fully repay. Agnes Wheeler appeared on the second morning with 6 bundles of dried herbs and took up a position at the herb station with the authority of someone who has been waiting for exactly this assignment. Cole drove supply runs twice a day without being asked, loading and unloading crates with a focused silence that, Savannah understood, was his version of an apology for every time he had said the words too many jars. By the 21st of December, 23 households had reported illness. The clinic was overwhelmed. Dr. Hale was running on coffee and 3 hours of sleep a night, and his face had taken on the gray, pressed look of a man spending himself at a rate that wasn't sustainable. And in the middle of all of it, in the steaming lamplight warmth of Henderson's converted storage space, Savannah Brooks stood at her stove and cooked. She cooked with the totality of everything her mother had taught her and everything she had taught herself in 15 years of quiet, purposeful preparation for exactly this moment. She cooked with her hands that never stopped moving, her eyes that tracked a dozen things at once, her voice calling instructions to volunteers in the practical, unpatronizing tone of someone who knows what she's doing and needs others to do it with her. She cooked for Thomas Boyle and Margaret Caldwell and the Gunther children and the 23 households and the 100 more she knew were coming. Outside, Red Hollow, Montana shuddered in the grip of the worst winter in a generation. Inside, something was beginning, something small and warm and stubborn that the cold had not yet reached and could not easily extinguish. But the worst was still ahead, and Savannah, stirring broth in the lamplight, with flour on her apron and exhaustion in her bones and absolute unbroken determination in her eyes, did not yet know how much harder it was about to get. Dr. Theodore Hale collapsed on the morning of December 23rd, not dramatically, not the way men collapse in stories with a crash and a cry and people rushing in. He simply sat down on the floor of his clinic between the two occupied cots and did not get up again. His assistant, a 16-year-old boy named Eli Dawson, who had been apprenticing with him since September, found him there 20 minutes later, sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up and his eyes open, staring at nothing with the focused blankness of a machine that has run past its limit and quietly shut itself down. Eli ran for Savannah. She was at Henderson's storage space, the community kitchen, as people had begun calling it, though nobody had officially named it, standing over the largest pot with a ladle in her hand and flour on her collar, directing 3 volunteers through the morning's first broth batch. She heard Eli's boots on the frozen ground before he got the door open, heard the particular panic in his footsteps, and was already setting down the ladle before he'd finished his first sentence. "How long has he been awake?" she asked, moving. I don't know, Mrs. Mercer. 3 days, maybe 4. He stopped going home." She pushed through the clinic door and found Hale exactly as Eli had described him, sitting on the floor, alive, conscious, but so deeply exhausted that consciousness itself seemed like a thing he was doing out of sheer stubborn habit rather than any genuine capacity. He looked up when she came in and managed something that was almost a wry expression. "I'm fine," he said. His voice came out like gravel. "You're on the floor," she said. "I sat down to think." "Theodore." She crouched in front of him, and this was the first time she had used his given name, and something in the directness of it made him blink. "You have to sleep." "There are patients." "I know. I'll sit with them." She looked at Eli. "Help me get him to the back room." "Savannah, I can't leave the clinic unattended." "You're not leaving it unattended. You're leaving it with me." She met his eyes steadily, and what he saw there, the same absolute unargued certainty she had carried since December began, was apparently enough because he stopped talking and let Eli help him to his feet. 6 hours, she told him. "If anything changes critically, I'll wake you." He was asleep before she'd finished tucking the blanket around him, which told her everything she needed to know about how long he'd actually been running on nothing. She pulled a chair between the 2 occupied cots. Old Bernard Simmons, 68, who had been the first of the older residents to fall badly sick, and a ranch hand named Luis Vega, whose employer had brought him in 3 days ago, half delirious with fever. And she sat there through the morning with her hands in her lap, monitoring both men with the quiet attention she had learned from her mother, which was not dramatic and not theatrical, but simply present in the way that mattered most, completely, without distraction. Between checks, she sent Eli back to the community kitchen with instructions for the volunteer crew. She wrote in her notebook. She cataloged what the clinic had in terms of medical supplies, which was considerably less than she would have liked, but more manageable than she'd feared if it was rationed with discipline. And she thought, with the systematic clarity that had become her primary mode of operating, about what the next week required and what the week after that might demand. The numbers were not comfortable. 31 households now. Roughly 90 people in various stages of illness, from the early fever cases that responded quickly to the broth and rest regimen, to the severe respiratory cases like Bernard Simmons, who wheezed through every breath with a sound like wind through a broken shutter. The community kitchen was feeding approximately 200 people daily, the sick and their caregivers and the volunteers who kept the operation running, and the stores were holding, but only because Savannah had been managing them with the precision of a woman who knew exactly how much margin she had and refused to let anyone treat it carelessly. The problem was not of the food. The problem was that people were tired. The volunteers who had come with energy and purpose in the first week were moving through their third and fourth days of this with the slumped shoulders and hollow eyes of people who had begun to understand that this was not a short emergency, but a long one, and that the long ones required a different kind of endurance than the short ones, and that they weren't sure they had it. Savannah understood this. She had felt it herself, the particular grinding exhaustion of days that blurred into each other, of sleeping in pieces and waking to the same cold and the same need and the same impossible arithmetic. What she had that some of the volunteers didn't was the habit of endurance, the years of quiet, disciplined work that had conditioned her for sustained effort in a way that most people, through no fault of their own, simply hadn't been. Her body knew how to do this. It was not enjoyable, but it knew. What she had not accounted for, what no amount of preparation had fully insulated her against, was what she found waiting for her when she returned home on the evening of the 23rd. Cole was sitting at the kitchen table with two men she recognized, Preston Hargrove, whose family ran the general store, and a rancher named Douglas Fitch, who had the thick arms and thin patience of a man accustomed to being listened to. They looked up when she came in, and Cole had the expression he wore when a conversation had been going in a direction he wasn't certain about, and wasn't certain how to redirect. "Mrs. Mercer," said Preston Hargrove, "glad you're home. We were hoping to speak with you." She took off her coat and hung it without hurry. "Speak," she said. Hargrove had the kind of face that was permanently arranged in an expression of reasonable concern, the face of a man who delivered bad news and unwelcome opinions in the language of practical necessity, which made it very difficult to argue with him without seeming irrational. "We're concerned," he said, "about the rate of consumption at the community kitchen." "The rate of consumption," she repeated. "You're going through Caldwell's grain faster than the original estimates, and the herb stores from Wheeler are nearly depleted." He folded his hands on the table. "Some of us on the council feel that, given the uncertainty about how long the winter will run, we ought to be considering a more conservative approach to distribution." The room was very quiet. The fire popped. "Conservative," Savannah said. "Smaller portions. Priority given to households that are contributing resources rather than those that are simply receiving." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Douglas Fitch, who had the grace to drop his eyes to the table. Then she looked at Cole, who met her gaze with an expression that said very clearly, "I didn't invite them, and I don't agree with them, but I didn't know how to end this before you got here." "Let me make sure I understand you," Savannah said, pulling out a chair and sitting down with the deliberate calm of a woman who has learned that the moments when you most want to raise your voice are precisely the moments when you must not. "You want me to feed less to the sick and to determine who receives food based on what their family has contributed to the common store. It's a matter of sustainability. It is a matter of who we decide matters," she said. The words came out flat and clear and without any particular drama, which made them land harder than anger would have. "The Vega family has 3 ranch hands down with fever. They have no resources to contribute. Are you telling me Luis Vega should receive smaller portions because he owns no grain store?" "That is exactly what you're describing." She kept her voice level. "Preston, I have been inside 31 sick households in the past 10 days. I have watched children drink broth and watch their fevers break. I have watched old Bernard Simmons breathe easier after 2 days of consistent nourishment. The broth isn't a luxury. For the severe cases, it is the difference." She paused. "If we reduce it, people will die. I want you to understand that plainly, because I suspect it's easier to talk about conservative distribution when you haven't stood beside a 6-year-old in the dark of 3 in the morning, wondering whether he's going to make it to morning." Hargrove was quiet. Fitch was still looking at the table. "We're running out, Mrs. Mercer," Fitch said finally. It was the first thing he'd said since she'd come in, and to his credit, his voice carried genuine discomfort rather than hostility. I've got my own family to think about. We all do. I know, she said, and she said it without contempt because she understood it. The animal calculation of a frightened person trying to protect what's his. Douglas, I know. That's real. And I'm not asking anyone to give until they have nothing. She looked around the table. But I need you to trust me when I tell you that I have been keeping this ledger. She set her notebook on the table, open to the supply columns, every single day since December the 12th. And I know exactly what we have and what we need and how long it runs if we manage it the way I'm managing it. We are not out of margin yet. We have 2 weeks of current level distribution if nothing changes. And if the severe cases continue to recover at the current rate, the demand actually decreases over time. Hargrove leaned forward and looked at the notebook. He was quiet for a long moment. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she confirmed, after which the worst cases will have resolved one way or another, and the remaining sick will be well enough to receive reduced support without medical consequence. Another silence. Cole, who had not spoken, refilled everyone's coffee with the quiet efficiency of a man grateful to have something useful to do with his hands. All right, Hargrove said finally. He did not say it warmly. He said it the way men like him concede points, carefully, preserving as much dignity as the concession allowed. 2 weeks, current level, but I want to be kept informed of the ledger. You can review it any morning you come to the kitchen, Savannah said. You're welcome there. He and Fitch left shortly after. Cole closed the door behind them and turned around, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the kitchen. Two people who had been living in the same house for years and were only now, in the middle of a disaster, beginning to actually see each other. 2 weeks, Cole said. Is that really where we are? She was quiet for a beat. It's where we are if nothing gets worse, she said. He absorbed this. And if something gets worse, then we'll need more than what we have. Where does more come from? She looked at him steadily. That's what I've been trying to figure out since this morning. The answer came from an unexpected direction on Christmas Eve. Agnes Wheeler arrived at the community kitchen at 7 in the morning with a sled, a neighbor's teenage son pulling it, and a collection of items wrapped in oilcloth that turned out to be something Savannah hadn't known existed, a second herb cache, hidden in Agnes's barn in a storage space that the old woman had apparently been filling for 20 years without mentioning it to anyone. My husband thought I was peculiar, Agnes said, unwrapping bundles of dried herbs with the brisk efficiency of someone who has waited a long time to deploy a resource. He died in 1869, and I kept adding to it anyway. Habit. She set a large bundle of dried willow bark on the work table. Good for fever. I have 8 pounds. Savannah stared at the bundles accumulating on the table. Yarrow, elderberry, dried ginger root, mullein for the lung cases, peppermint, valerian for the sleepless patients. Herbs in quantities that represented not one winter's growth but many, stored with the same patient, stubborn foresight that Savannah recognized because it was the same foresight she had learned from her own mother. Agnes, she said quietly, why didn't you say you had this? The old woman looked up with eyes that were sharp and clear and completely unapologetic. Because nobody asked me, she said, and because I wanted to see first whether the person running this kitchen was the kind of person who deserved to know about it. A pause. And, Savannah said, Agnes picked up another bundle. And you are, she said simply. So, here I am. Agnes's cash bought them more than 2 weeks. It bought them the margin Savannah needed. Not comfort, not ease, but the narrow, sufficient margin of a town that was going to survive if it held together. But even as the herb supplies were reshelved and the ledger revised, the illness itself was shifting into something more serious. Bernard Simmons died on the 26th of December. He went quietly, in the night, with Eli Dawson sitting beside him, because Hale was with another critical case, and Savannah was delivering to the East Ridge households, and there was no one else. Eli was 17 years old and had never watched a person die, and he sat with old Bernard for a long time afterward in the lamplight of the clinic, alone, before he got up and went to find Savannah. She received the news standing in the cold outside the last house on her delivery route, and she stood very still for a moment with the empty crate in her hands, looking at the dark sky. She had known Bernard Simmons would likely not recover. She had known it since the first morning she'd sat beside him in the clinic, known it the way her mother had taught her to recognize the particular quality of an illness that has gone too deep to be countered by broth and rest and elderberry. She had not said so to anyone. She had nourished him and kept him as comfortable as the resources allowed and not said so, because knowing something is likely does not mean giving up on it. But she had known. She stood in the cold and breathed, and the grief moved through her cleanly and completely, the way grief moves through people who cannot afford to let it stay. Then she picked up the crate and walked back to the kitchen. Hale told her the following morning that Bernard was the third death in the valley. One of the Simmons ranch hands and a 12-year-old boy from an outlying homestead had died in the last 5 days, in households too far from the community kitchen to receive daily support. 3 deaths. In a town of 412 people, 3 deaths felt like a tolling bell. And then word came from Millhaven. Millhaven was a settlement 20 miles south, slightly larger than Red Hollow, which had been following the epidemic news from the north with the cautious concern of people who believe that distance confers safety. The telegram arrived on December 28th, relayed through the nearest functional telegraph station. Millhaven had 22 dead. The illness had hit them 3 weeks after Bitterroot Ridge, moved faster than anyone had prepared for, and found a community with no coordinated response and no significant food reserves, and no one who had spent August calculating what a hard winter would require. 22 dead. Hale read the telegram aloud in the community kitchen to the assembled volunteers, and the room went the specific quiet that follows news that is both terrible in itself and terrifying in its proximity. People looked at each other. Someone made a small, involuntary sound. Ruth Boyle pressed her hands flat on the work table and stared at them. "That could have been us," said a rancher named Jim Weathers, who had come in to volunteer 2 days ago and had not left since. He said it in the voice of someone who has just understood something. "It still could be," Savannah said. Everyone looked at her. She was standing at the main stove with a ladle in her hand, and she had not raised her voice or changed her expression, and the flatness of the statement was more effective than any alarm she could have sounded. "We have 37 sick households," she continued. "Dr. Hale is working beyond his capacity. We have 4 volunteers who are showing early symptoms, which means our kitchen crew is about to get smaller. And we have news that a settlement 3 times our size just lost 22 people to the same illness we are fighting right now." She set down the ladle. "I will not tell you that we are safe. I will tell you that we are not Millhaven, and the reason we are not Millhaven is the work that every person in this room has done over the past 2 weeks. But if that work stops, if we get tired and careful and start thinking about ourselves before we think about the people in those sick households, we will become Millhaven very quickly." The silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a room full of people looking into a hard truth and deciding what to do with it. Jim Weathers spoke first. "What do you need?" "More hands," she said immediately. "There are families in this town who have not sent anyone to help. Healthy families, capable families, people who have been waiting to see how this goes before they commit." She looked around the room. "They need to understand that waiting is over. The time to commit is now, before we lose more people, before we lose the margin we've built." "They won't come on their own," said Ruth Boyle. "Not all of them. They need to be asked directly." "Then we ask them directly," Savannah said. "You should be the one to do it," Agnes Wheeler said from her place at the herb station. She said it with the authority of a woman who has been watching people for 7 decades and has learned when to say the plain thing. "Not the council, not Hale. You." Her sharp eyes found Savannah across the kitchen. "Because you're the one they need to hear it from. You're the one who's actually been keeping this town alive, and every person in this room knows it, and half the people out there know it even if they haven't said so yet." Savannah looked at the old woman for a moment. Agnes met her gaze without blinking. "I'm not," she began. "Don't," Agnes said sharply. "Don't you say you're not the right person. Don't you say someone else should do it. I am 73 years old, and I have watched the right person talk themselves out of the necessary thing too many times, and I will not watch you do it." The kitchen was utterly still. Savannah stood at the stove in her flour-dusted apron, with her rough-stained hands and her exhausted face, and the weight of the past 2 weeks in every line of her body, and she felt the thing that Agnes was naming, felt it the way you feel something true when you've been carrying it without acknowledging it. The knowledge, quiet and certain and slightly frightening, that she was the one. Not because she had been chosen, not because anyone had appointed her, not because the town had decided she deserved it, but simply because she had been doing it, day after day, and nobody else had. And the moment required the person who had been showing up. She picked up the ladle. She went back to the pot. "Tell every healthy household in Red Hollow that there will be a meeting tomorrow morning," she said, "at the community kitchen, 9 o'clock. She stirred without looking up. "Tell them Savannah Mercer is calling the meeting." Nobody argued. Nobody questioned it. Ruth went to put on her coat. Jim Weathers followed. The kitchen filled with the sound of purposeful movement. Boots on wood floors, doors opening and closing, voices going out into the cold with a message and a direction. Cole was standing in the doorway. He had come in quietly sometime during the conversation and had said nothing, just watched. She had not noticed him until now. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something open and unguarded and entirely without the careful distance he usually maintained. And when she met his eyes, he did not look away. He walked across the kitchen and took the ladle from her hand gently. "Go home," he said quietly. "Sleep for 4 hours. I'll manage the afternoon batch." "Cole, I've been watching you do this for 2 weeks," he said. "I know how to do the afternoon batch." He held her gaze. "You need 4 hours. Tomorrow's going to take everything you have." She looked at her husband, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when you've stopped taking their presence for granted, and something shifted between them, subtle and significant and not yet fully named. "Don't let the fire drop below medium," she said. "I know. And the herbs go in during the last hour, not before. Savannah." His voice was steady and warm and entirely certain. "I know. Go home." She went home. She slept for 5 hours, not 4, which was the deepest sleep she had managed in 2 weeks. And she woke in the dark of early morning with her heart already hammering and her mind already working. Tomorrow, today, now, Red Hollow would either pull itself together or it would not. The people who had been watching from the edges would either step forward or they would not. And she, the large, overlooked, quietly stubborn woman who had spent years preparing for a disaster nobody believed was coming, was going to stand in front of her town and ask them to follow her. She got up. She put on her strongest boots. She went to the kitchen and started the fire. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls of the house with the blind, patient force of something that has all the time in the world. Savannah put the kettle on and waited for morning. The morning of December 29th arrived the way mornings arrive in the deep heart of a Montana winter. Not with light exactly, but with a gradual, reluctant lessening of dark, the sky shifting from black to the color of old pewter, the snow on the ground giving back a faint luminescence that made the world look lit from below rather than above. Savannah had been awake since 4. She had stoked the community kitchen fire, started the first broth batch, checked on the 4 volunteers who had been sleeping in rotation on cots near the stove, and walked through the supply inventory once more with her notebook and her lamp, tallying figures she already knew by heart because the habit of certainty mattered more than the information itself. By 8:30, people had begun to arrive. Not the usual volunteers, Ruth and Agnes and Jim Weathers and the others who had been showing up reliably since the second week. Different people. People Savannah recognized from the edges of town, from the back pews of the sewing circle, from the far end of the market on Saturday mornings. The Hartley family, who owned the grain mill at the creek and had contributed nothing since the crisis began. The Moreau brothers, whose cattle ranch employed 6 men, all of whom were still healthy. Caroline Preston, who was 26 and the sharpest mind on the women's committee and had been conspicuously absent from the volunteer roster. They came in 1s and 2s and small family groups, stomping snow from their boots, looking around the kitchen with expressions that moved between curiosity and discomfort, and something that might have been shame if you looked at it sideways. By 9 o'clock, the kitchen was fuller than it had ever been. Savannah counted 43 people, which was more than she had dared to expect, and she took a single breath and walked to the center of the room. She had thought about what she would say. She had turned it over during the dark morning hours, considering and discarding approaches. The appeal to fear, the appeal to duty, the appeal to the specific human faces of the sick. She had decided, in the end, on the truth. Just the truth, plainly spoken, without decoration and without apology. "Thank you for coming," she said, and her voice carried without effort in the warm, close space. "I'm going to tell you exactly where we are, because I think you deserve to know and because I believe that people who understand the situation clearly make better decisions than people who are being managed." The room was very still. She could hear the fire and the wind and nothing else. "We have 37 households with active illness, approximately 104 people sick in various stages. 3 of those people have died. Bernard Simmons, a ranch hand named Cal Pruitt, and 12-year-old Danny Marsh from the Harker homestead." She said the names deliberately because names were what separated statistics from reality, and she wanted everyone in the room to feel the reality. "Millhaven has 22 dead. Bitterroot Ridge lost 11 before the illness began to slow. Those settlements did not have a community kitchen. They did not have coordinated distribution. They did not have what we have built here over the past 2 weeks." She paused and let that settle. "What we have built is not yet enough," she continued. "Dr. Hale is exhausted. 4 of our volunteers are showing early symptoms. The stores are holding, but only because every ounce of what we have has been managed with absolute precision. If we continue exactly as we are, with the same number of people doing the same amount of work, we will lose more." She looked around the room, met eyes one by one without flinching. "If we expand, if the people in this room who have not yet contributed step forward now, we will not lose more. I believe that. I believe it because I have been inside every sick household in this valley, and what I have seen is that the people who receive consistent nourishment and warmth recover. The ones who don't are the ones we bury." Something moved through the room, not sound, not movement, but a shift in the quality of attention, like a current changing direction. Walter Caldwell spoke from the back of the room. He had come, which had surprised her when she'd seen him arrive, and he had brought his foreman and 2 ranch hands. "What do you need from us specifically, Mrs. Mercer? Not in general terms, specifically." Savannah had her notebook. She opened it to the page she had prepared. "The Hartley Mill has a covered wagon and a team of draft horses that are better suited to deep snow than anything else in this valley," she said, looking at Thomas Hartley directly. "I need that wagon running a supply route twice a day to the outlying homesteads, the ones too far for the volunteers on foot to reach reliably. Those are the households where Danny Marsh died. Those are the households that will become Millhaven if we leave them isolated." Thomas Hartley was a quiet man with a weathered face who had the look of someone who had been waiting to be asked a specific question rather than a general one. "I can do that," he said, "starting today." "The Moreau cattle operation," she continued, looking at the older of the 2 brothers, a broad-shouldered man named Henri. "You have cattle you plan to sell in spring. I'm asking you to slaughter 2 now for the broth. I know what that costs. I have a ledger entry for it, and the council has agreed to arrange spring compensation from the community store." She did not soften the ask or dress it up. She made it the way her mother had made hard requests, directly, with respect, and with the clear understanding that the person being asked was capable of generosity if they were treated as such. Henri Moreau looked at his brother for a moment. His brother gave a small nod. 2 cattle, Henri said. "We'll bring them in tomorrow morning." She went through the list. Every ask was specific. Every ask was matched to what she knew about the person she was asking. Their resources, their capacity, their particular form of usefulness. Caroline Preston, whose organizational ability she had observed for years from the back of the sewing circle, she asked to take over the delivery schedule coordination, freeing Savannah to focus on the kitchen production. Caroline's chin came up slightly when her name was called, and something lit in her eyes, the particular brightness of a capable person being finally correctly deployed. "I can have a full schedule drawn up by noon," Caroline said. "I know you can," Savannah said. "That's why I'm asking you." The room, by the time she had worked through the list, had changed its character entirely. It was no longer a collection of uncertain individuals waiting to be convinced. It was something closer to a crew, people who had been given specific purposes and had accepted them, the loose collection of goodwill and anxiety organizing itself around practical action, the way water organizes itself around a channel. Jim Weathers raised his hand from the middle of the room. "Mrs. Mercer, what about you? What are you doing besides all of this?" It was asked genuinely, without edge, and it produced a small ripple of something almost like laughter, the first laughter Savannah had heard in the kitchen in 2 weeks. "I'm cooking," she said simply, and the ripple became something warmer and more genuine, because everyone in that room understood by now what that single word contained. The transformation of Red Hollow over the following 4 days was the kind of thing that, if you described it to someone in October, would have sounded like a story someone was telling to make a point rather than a thing that was actually happening. But it happened. Thomas Hartley's heavy wagon broke trail to the outlying homesteads twice a day, carrying food and herbs and the simple, essential message that the town had not forgotten you. Caroline Preston's delivery schedule, handwritten and precise, appeared on the kitchen wall by noon on the 29th and was revised and updated daily with the meticulous thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting years for a task genuinely worthy of her attention. Henri Moreau's cattle went into the pot on the 30th, and the quality of the broth improved in a way that the patients receiving it could taste and that Hale confirmed was having measurable effect on recovery rates. Families who had kept to themselves appeared at the kitchen with contributions they'd been sitting on. A bushel of dried corn from the Weber farm, 2 gallons of preserved apple from the Dalton household, enough dried fish from old Pete Samuelson's smokehouse to feed the kitchen crew for a week. Each contribution was received, recorded in Savannah's ledger, and deployed within 24 hours because she understood that resources sitting still were resources being wasted. Hale slept a full 8 hours on the night of the 29th, which was the most he had slept since December began, and woke with something restored in him that the exhaustion had temporarily extinguished. He came to the kitchen the following morning looking more like himself and found Savannah at the main stove, unremarkable in her flour-dusted apron, working with the focused efficiency he had come to think of as the kitchen's particular atmosphere, the sense that the woman at the center of it was operating at exactly the right frequency for the work at hand. 2 patients discharged this morning, he told her, the Reeves girl and one of the Gunther children, recovered enough to go home. Savannah nodded without stopping what she was doing. The Boyle boy has been recovered for 2 weeks. I've asked Ruth to help with the delivery route. Frees up a slot in the kitchen for someone who hasn't been running as hard. Hale watched her for a moment. The new cases yesterday, he said carefully. Only 3. She looked up. Only 3. The day before was 7. The day before that was 9. We're past the peak, Savannah. He said her name with the ease of the past 2 weeks, which had dissolved whatever formality the title had carried. The curve is bending. She set down the ladle and looked at him, and for a moment something moved across her face that was not quite relief. Relief was too passive for what it was. It was the expression of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told that the distance to the end is shorter than it looked, and who is simultaneously grateful and aware that the heavy thing is still in their hands and must be carried the rest of the way regardless. 3 new cases, she said. 3. Then we keep going, she said, and picked up the ladle. Cole was in the kitchen that afternoon, managing the second broth batch with an attention and competence that would have astonished anyone who had known him in October. He had arrived each morning for the past 4 days without announcement, taken whatever task most needed doing, and done it without complaint or comment. He had become, in the quiet way of men who express things through action rather than language, the kitchen's most reliable infrastructure. The person who kept the fires stoked and the water barrels filled and the crates moved without being asked, who covered for whoever was flagging and never required direction or acknowledgement. On the afternoon of the 30th, while the second batch simmered and the kitchen hummed with the particular purposeful noise of people who have found their roles, Cole set down the crate he was moving and crossed the kitchen to where Savannah was working and stood beside her for a moment without speaking. She glanced at him. "I owe you something," he said. His voice was low for her alone in the kitchen noise. "I've been thinking about how to say it for a week." "Cole, let me finish." He looked at the pot, not at her, which was how he always managed the things that cost him. The jars, the broth, the wood, the counting and the planning and the 2 hours in the cellar the night you heard about Bitterroot Ridge. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were anxious. I thought it was something women did. The hoarding and the worrying, because it made you feel better. I thought—" He stopped, tried again. "I didn't see what you were doing. I didn't understand that you were the only person in this valley who was paying the right kind of attention." He finally looked at her. "I'm sorry for every time I made you feel like you were being foolish." The kitchen moved around them. Voices, ladles, the creak of the floorboards under heavy boots. Savannah looked at her husband, at this man she had lived beside for years without either of them fully understanding what the other contained, and she felt the complicated warmth of something that had been injured and was now, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to heal. "You brought me wood," she said, "in November, when I told you the winter would be hard." He nodded. "That mattered," she said. "You didn't believe me yet, but you brought the wood anyway. That mattered more than you know." He held her gaze for a moment, and in it was everything that men like Cole Mercer found impossible to put into words, and managed instead to make visible in a look. The recognition, the regret, the thing that was trying to be something more than it had been. "More crates need moving," he said finally, the way he closed every moment that had gone as deep as he could take it. "Then move them," she said, with the smallest edge of warmth in her voice. And she went back to the pot, and he went back to the crates, and between them something had shifted that wouldn't shift back. New Year's arrived without ceremony. There was no celebration in Red Hollow that year, no gathering at the Iron Mule, no counting down in the street. The holiday passed through the town the way a quiet day passes through a working household, noticed, acknowledged, and otherwise unremarkable in the face of things that needed doing. Savannah registered it when Ruth Boyle said, "Happy New Year, Mrs. Mercer," in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, and she looked up and realized she had not thought about the date at all. "Happy New Year, Ruth," she said, and meant it more than she had meant a pleasantry in a long time. The first week of January brought the numbers that Hale had dared to say aloud on the 30th. New cases dropped to 2, then 1, then a day with none. Recovery rates climbed. The severe cases, the ones who had terrified everyone, including Savannah, began, slowly and unevenly, to turn corners. Old Bill Wheeler, Agnes's nearest neighbor, and a man of 70 who had been in the clinic for 3 weeks, and whose breathing had, at one point, frightened Hale into a silence more eloquent than words, sat up on January 3rd and asked for real food. Hale gave him broth. He drank 2 cups and said it was the best thing he'd ever tasted, which was either the fever talking or a genuine testament to the quality of Savannah's broth, and either way it made Eli Dawson, who was sitting with him, laugh for the first time in weeks. The outlying homesteads, the ones that Thomas Hartley's wagon had been reaching twice daily, the ones that might otherwise have become the valley's mill haven, reported their own improvements. A family named Crane, who had been too sick and too far to know about the community kitchen until the wagon reached them on December 30th, sent their eldest daughter into town on January 2nd with a letter for Savannah that the girl delivered with the solemnity of someone carrying something important. The letter was brief, written in a rough hand on the kind of paper people use when they don't write often. "Mrs. Mercer, my husband and 2 sons are improved. We did not think they would be. We would not say thank you because it is not sufficient, but we do not have any better word. Thank you. Mary Crane." Savannah read it at the kitchen work table, alone for a moment in the unusual quiet of early morning. She folded it carefully, put it in the front pocket of her notebook, and sat with it for a moment. 3 dead out of 412. Against Millhavens, 22. Against Bitterroot Ridges, 11. In a town that had been, until December, entirely unprepared. No organized response, no coordinated resources, nothing but one woman's cellar and one woman's refusal to stop. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the weight of the 3 as heavily as the relief of the living. Bernard Simmons, Cal Pruitt, Danny Marsh, whose faces she carried alongside the faces of the recovered, because she believed, with the same conviction she brought to everything, that the people you could not save deserved to be remembered as specifically and as permanently as the ones you did. But she felt something else too, something quieter and more durable than triumph. She felt the particular solidity of a person who has been tested at the full measure of her capacity and discovered that the capacity was real. By the second week of January, the kitchen had become something that nobody had quite anticipated, and everybody had come to depend on not just a medical resource, but a social one, the warm, flower-scented center of a town that was relearning, or perhaps learning for the first time, what it meant to operate as a community rather than a collection of individual interests. People came to drop off contributions and stayed to help. Neighbors who had not spoken in years found themselves working side by side over the same pots, in the enforced proximity of shared purpose, and discovered that what had separated them had been smaller than what they had in common. Walter Caldwell sat at the same work table as Luis Vega's father and passed him a cup of coffee without any ceremony whatsoever, which 6 weeks ago would have been remarked upon by half the town and was now simply what happened at the kitchen. Caroline Preston appeared at Savannah's elbow on the 10th of January with a proposal written in her meticulous hand, a permanent organization structure for the kitchen, with rotating volunteer schedules, a community supply fund, and a protocol for emergency response that could be activated without the crisis that had built it. She laid it on the table beside Savannah's notebook with the directness of a woman who has found her confidence and no longer requires permission to use it. It would need someone to run it permanently, Caroline said, someone the town trusts. Savannah read through the proposal without speaking. It was good. It was, in several respects, better organized than the system she had built on the fly under crisis conditions, because Caroline had the luxury of building it without a blizzard pressing at the walls. "This is excellent," she said. "It needs you," Caroline said. Savannah looked up. "Not because no one else could manage it," Caroline said, with the careful precision of a woman choosing words, "but because you're the reason this town is still whole. People know that now. They know it in the way you can't unknow something once you've seen it." She held Savannah's gaze. "If you attach your name to this, every family in Red Hollow will support it. If you don't, half of them will find reasons to let it fade when the crisis is over, because that is what people do." Savannah was quiet for a long moment, looking at the proposal. "You'd be on the committee," she said finally. "Gladly," said Caroline. "And Agnes, her knowledge of the herb stores needs to be formal, not just Agnes showing up when she decides to." "Agreed. And I'll need Cole to manage the supply logistics. He's better at the physical inventory than I am, if I'm honest." She paused. "And Hale needs a formal role, not just a consulting one." "I'll add them all," Caroline said, and picked up her pen. Agnes Wheeler, when told about the proposal that afternoon, said only, "About time," and went back to her herbs. Cole, when told that evening over supper, sat with it for a moment and then said, "You'd really want me involved? Officially?" "You've been involved officially since December 22nd, Savannah said. "I'm just asking if you want it written down." He looked at his coffee. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I want it written down." Outside, the snow was still deep, but the temperature had lifted. Not to warmth, not yet. Not in January in Montana, but to the kind of cold that feels survivable rather than absolute, the kind that doesn't press against the walls with quite the same intention. The blizzard that had hammered Red Hollow for 6 weeks had pulled back to something ordinary, and in that ordinary cold the valley was finding its footing again. The sick were recovering, the kitchen was full, the deliveries were running, the ledger was balanced, and in the center of all of it, not loudly, not triumphantly, not in the manner of someone who has been waiting to be recognized, stood Savannah Brooks Mercer, 31 years old, large and capable, and permanently flower-dusted, running the operation she had quietly built from the ground up while everyone around her looked the other way. She had not saved the town by being chosen or appointed or recognized. She had saved it by showing up day after day, in the dark before dawn and the cold after midnight, and every ordinary, unremarkable hour in between, doing the work that needed doing with the hands that happened to be available, which were hers. Red Hollow did not yet fully understand what it owed her. That understanding was still forming, the way understanding always forms in communities, slowly, imperfectly, through accumulated evidence that eventually becomes impossible to argue with. But it was forming, and when it arrived, it would be the kind of understanding that stays. The last patient left the community clinic on the 14th of January. It was Luis Vega, the ranch hand who had been one of the earliest severe cases, the man who had lain delirious for 4 days while Savannah sat between his cot and Bernard Simmons, monitoring both with the quiet attention of someone who understood that presence itself is a form of medicine. He walked out under his own power, which was not something anyone had been certain he would do in those first terrible days. He was thin and moved carefully, the way people move when they have been very sick and their body is still negotiating the terms of recovery. But he was upright and his eyes were clear, and when he reached the clinic doorway, he stopped and turned back to look at Eli Dawson, who was standing beside the empty cot with his hands in his pockets. "Tell Dr. Hale thank you," Vega said. "And tell Mrs. Mercer—" He stopped, looked at the floor for a moment. "Tell her I remember the broth Even when I was out of my head with fever, I remember someone giving me something warm." He looked up. "I didn't know who it was then. I know now." Eli nodded. He was 17 and had seen more death and recovery in 6 weeks than most people see in a decade. And it had changed the shape of his face in ways that wouldn't entirely reverse. "I'll tell her," he said. Vega walked out into the January cold, and Eli stood in the empty clinic for a moment, listening to the silence of a room that had been full of suffering for more than a month, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been pulled tight since December 23rd. Savannah heard the news at the kitchen, where she was reviewing the week's supply ledger with Caroline Preston. She received it the way she had received most of the good news over the past weeks, with a nod, a moment of stillness, and then a return to whatever she had been doing, because the habit of moving forward was by this point so deeply ingrained that stopping felt unnatural even when stopping was warranted. Caroline watched her write the entry in the ledger and said, "You're allowed to feel good about this, you know." Savannah glanced up. "I do feel good about it." "You look like you're calculating inventory." "I am calculating inventory and feeling good about it." She turned a page. "They're not mutually exclusive." Caroline made a sound that was almost a laugh. She had become, over the past 2 weeks, something closer to a genuine friend than Savannah had experienced in Red Hollow. Not the careful, formal friendship of women performing compatibility at a sewing circle, but the real kind that forms under pressure, when people see each other without the usual social furniture and decide they like what's underneath. It was imperfect and occasionally blunt and sometimes interrupted by disagreements about the delivery schedule that got sharp before they got resolved, which was, Savannah had come to understand exactly what friendship actually looks like when it's honest. "The meeting is set for the 22nd, Caroline said, returning to her own papers. "Town council confirmed this morning." Savannah did not look up. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where they want to formally acknowledge what you did and present you with—" Caroline paused, consulting her notes. "A certificate of community service, apparently. And Walter Caldwell has been talking about a permanent designation, something official." "A certificate," Savannah said. "I know. The man has 2,000 pounds of grain, and he's giving me a certificate. He's also agreed to anchor the spring replenishment fund for the community store and allow the kitchen to operate permanently from his donated lumber." Caroline looked up. "The certificate is the ceremonial part. The rest is actually substantive." Savannah was quiet for a moment. She set down her pen. Outside, the January light was doing something she had not seen in weeks, falling clean and direct through the kitchen window without the gray filter of storm clouds, making a rectangle of pale gold on the wooden floor that was not warmth, not yet, but was the suggestion of warmth, the memory of what warmth looked like. "I don't want a ceremony," she said. "I know you don't," Caroline said. "But the town needs one. It's not about you specifically. It's about them. About Red Hollow needing to look at what it did and decide what kind of place it wants to be going forward." She paused. "And about making sure you're not invisible anymore. Which matters, even if you'd rather it didn't." Savannah looked at her. Caroline held the gaze with the particular steadiness of a woman who has learned to say uncomfortable true things without flinching. "Fine," Savannah said, and picked up her pen. "But I'm not wearing my good dress. It doesn't fit properly anyway." "Wear whatever you want," Caroline said. "You've earned it." The days between the 14th and the 22nd were the closest thing to ordinary that Red Hollow had experienced since November. Not normal. Normal was months away, and some things would never return to exactly what they had been, which was not entirely a loss. But ordinary in the sense that people woke up and went about their business without the specific dread that had colored every morning since December. Children returned to the schoolhouse. The Iron Mule reopened its back room for the Saturday evening card games. Pete Henderson restocked his shelves with the quiet efficiency of a man who understands that commerce is also a form of normalcy. The kitchen kept running. Savannah had not expected it to taper off as quickly as the crisis resolved, and it didn't. People kept showing up, kept contributing, kept eating there, because a place that has been genuinely useful has a gravity of its own that doesn't simply evaporate when the emergency does. The sick were gone from the cots, but the kitchen fed the volunteers who had run themselves down, and the families of the recovered who were still rebuilding their strength, and the outlying homesteads that had been receiving deliveries and had formed the habit of connection with the town center that they weren't ready to surrender. Agnes Wheeler came every morning. She had been coming every morning since the 29th of December and showed no signs of stopping. She took up her position at the herb station with the authority of permanent tenure and offered her opinions on broth formulas, delivery protocols, volunteer scheduling, and local politics with equal and undiminished confidence. Savannah had stopped trying to redirect her opinions on the last category because Agnes Wheeler's political opinions were both relentless and, Savannah had to admit, usually correct. Hargrove will make trouble about the spring replenishment, Agnes said on the 18th, grinding dried ginger with the small stone mortar she had brought from her own kitchen. He agreed to things in December when he was scared. Scared men are generous. Men who are no longer scared start remembering what they'd rather keep. The agreement is in writing, Savannah said. Everything's in writing until someone decides to argue about what the writing means. Agnes did not look up from the mortar. You'll need Hale at that meeting, and Caldwell. Make sure they're standing next to you when Hargrove starts. Savannah looked at her. I thought the town meeting on the 22nd was a formality. Every town meeting is a formality, Agnes said. The real meeting is what happens in the conversations around it. She finally glanced up. You've kept this town fed and alive, and you are still surprised by how politics works. I'm not surprised, Savannah said. I'm tired. Agnes's expression shifted into something softer, which on her face was still fairly austere but was, for Agnes, a significant concession to tenderness. I know, she said. You've been tired since December. Keep going anyway. I know, Savannah said. That's what I've been doing. Good. Agnes went back to her grinding. Then keep doing it. Cole came home one evening that week, the 19th, a Tuesday, with a bottle of whiskey he had clearly been holding in reserve for some occasion that warranted it, and he set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment before looking at Savannah, who was sitting across from him with her notebook. I spoke to Walter Caldwell today, he said, about the spring cattle. And? He's agreed to a fair price. Better than fair, actually. Cole sat down. He said... He paused in the way he did when he was repeating something that had affected him. He said that his daughter recovered because of you, and that a man who can't account for that in his dealings isn't a man he wants to be. Savannah said nothing. He also said, Cole rubbed his jaw. He said he's ashamed about the way things were before, about how you were treated, ignored. He said he didn't have a good word for it, but he used the word ashamed, and I watched his face when he said it, and it was real. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. I don't need Walter Caldwell's shame, Savannah said. Not harshly, just plainly. I know. Cole looked at his hands on the table. I thought you should know that it's there, because sometimes knowing it changes something, even if it doesn't fix anything. She looked at her husband. He was 41 years old, weathered by the land in the way Montana men become weathered. Not aged exactly, but distilled. The non-essential parts worn away, and the essential parts left harder and clearer. He was not a man who had been transformed by the crisis into something unrecognizable. He was still the same man who'd said too many jars and hadn't looked closely enough, and had operated for years on the assumption that the person he lived with was competent but ordinary. The transformation, such as it was smaller and more realistic than transformation usually gets to be in the stories people tell. He saw her more clearly now. Not completely, not with perfect understanding, but more. Open the whiskey, she said. He looked up. Something in his face relaxed. 2 glasses, she said, and sit with me for a while. He got 2 glasses. He sat. They didn't talk much because they were not the kind of people who talked much when they were at ease with each other, and for the first time in a long time, they were at ease. The whiskey was cheap and slightly too strong and tasted like the kind of thing you drink when you've earned it, which they both had. Outside, the temperature had risen 3 degrees from the previous week. In Montana in January, 3 degrees is not spring, but it is the direction of spring, and direction matters more than distance when you've been standing in one place long enough. The morning of the 22nd arrived gray and cold and mercifully still. No wind, no new snow, just the hard, clear air of a Montana winter that has said what it wanted to say and is now simply waiting. The town gathered in front of Henderson's store, which had the widest porch in Red Hollow and could accommodate most of the population if people stood close, which they did, their breath making small clouds in the cold. Savannah almost didn't go. She had been in the kitchen since 5:30, running the morning batch, and when Caroline appeared at 7:45 to remind her that the gathering started at 8, Savannah said, "I know," and kept stirring. "Savannah." "I know, Caroline." "If you're not there, it undermines the whole—" "I said I know." She set down the ladle, she untied her apron. She looked down at her dress, which was the second best one and not the good one she'd refused to wear, and which had a small flour stain on the left sleeve that she hadn't noticed until this moment. She left the flour stain. She put on her coat and walked to Henderson's store. The crowd that had gathered was larger than she'd expected. Not just the town proper, but families from the outlying homesteads, people who had driven or ridden in through the January cold specifically for this. She recognized faces from the delivery routes, from the clinic, from the sewing circle, from 15 years of being present in this town as a peripheral figure. They were all here, and as she walked toward the porch through the crowd, something happened that she was entirely unprepared for. People made way for her, not the reflexive parting of a crowd for someone passing through, but the deliberate conscious making of space, people stepping aside with the specific intent of clearing a path, of acknowledging with their bodies what they couldn't quite say yet with words. And some of them, Ruth Boyle, who reached out and briefly pressed Savannah's arm as she passed. Thomas Hartley, who nodded in the way men nod when they mean something serious. Mary Crane's daughter, who had ridden in from the outlying homestead specifically, who looked at Savannah with the direct, clear eyes of someone delivering a message from her mother. Savannah kept walking. She kept her face still. She was not going to cry in front of 400 people in Red Hollow, Montana, which was a decision she had made before she left the kitchen and was now having to enforce with some effort. Walter Caldwell spoke first, from the porch. He was not a natural public speaker, too accustomed to rooms where his authority was assumed to have developed the habit of persuasion, but he spoke with a directness that morning that Savannah recognized as the same directness he'd used the night she'd sat in his parlor and told him what his daughter needed. "Red Hollow lost 3 people this winter," he said. "Bernard Simmons, Cal Pruitt, Danny Marsh." He said the names slowly without rushing past them. "Other settlements lost much more. I've been on the council of this town for 11 years, and I will tell you honestly that the council did not save us. The doctor helped, the volunteers helped, but the reason we are standing here, most of us still alive and still whole, is the work of one woman who started doing what needed to be done before any of us understood that it needed doing." He paused. "I've known Savannah Mercer for 8 years. I don't think I actually knew her until December." A silence moved through the crowd. Savannah stood near the back and did not move. "We'd like to ask her to come up," Caldwell said. She walked to the porch. The crowd was very quiet. She stood beside Caldwell and looked out at the faces of Red Hollow. All of them. The people who had helped and the people who hadn't. The people who'd contributed and the people who'd waited. The people who'd been kind to her over the years and the people who hadn't bothered. And she felt the complicated, unromantic weight of what it means to be seen by people who should have been looking sooner. Caldwell held out the certificate, which was exactly as anticlimactic as she'd expected. A piece of paper with formal language and a wax seal, the kind of thing you accept graciously and then put in a drawer. She accepted it graciously. Then Caldwell said, "There's one more thing. The council has voted unanimously to establish the Red Hollow Community Kitchen as a permanent institution operating year-round, to be maintained through community contribution and administered by a standing committee." He looked at her. "We'd like you to lead it, not as a volunteer, as a designated town official with the same standing as any other." She had known this was coming, Caroline had told her, and she had told Caroline she understood. And she did understand, but standing there with the paper in her hands, in front of everyone, it landed differently than understanding it had. "I'll need a proper budget," she said. Her voice was steady. "Not donations, a line in the town's accounts, agreed to annually by the council, and a committee with actual authority, not just advisory standing." Caldwell blinked. The crowd was very still. "I also need a written agreement on the spring replenishment contributions from all households that received support this winter," she continued, because Agnes had told her not to let the moment pass without securing what needed securing, and Agnes had been right about everything so far. "And Eli Dawson needs to be formally apprenticed to Dr. Hale. He's been doing the work for 2 months. He deserves the title and the training. Caldwell looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that was not quite amusement, more like recognition, the look of a man who has finally encountered a negotiation partner he respects. Done, he said. Done, done, and done. Hale, who was standing to the side of the porch, caught her eye and gave her the smallest nod. The nod of a man who is thinking about 17-year-old Eli Dawson sitting alone with Bernard Simmons in the dark of the clinic and had wanted this particular thing for weeks. She turned back to the crowd. She had not planned to say anything. She had planned to receive the certificate, agree to the kitchen proposal, and go back to the kitchen and make sure nobody had let the fire drop. But she stood there with the certificate in her flour-stained hands and looked at 400 people, and something came up in her that was not a speech. She was not a speech maker, had no talent for it, and no patience for the theatrical, but was something more like the plain statement of a thing that needed to be said before everyone went back to their ordinary lives, and the lesson got lost in the ordinariness. "I want to say something," she said, "not about gratitude, because you've been generous with that, and I don't need more of it." The crowd waited. "I've lived in this town for 12 years, she said. "Most of those years, I was not anyone you thought much about. I know that. I'm not saying it to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because it's true, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone." She looked out at them steadily. "What I did this winter, I was able to do because my mother taught me that the people who survive the hard things are not always the strongest or the fastest. They're the ones who prepared when nobody was watching and kept going when everybody stopped." She paused. "There are people in this valley, quiet people, plain people, people you don't think much about, who have been preparing and keeping going for years without anyone noticing. I'm asking you to start noticing, not just when there's a crisis, before one." The silence that followed was the kind that comes after something true has been said in a room. Not comfortable, not dramatic, just real. The silence of people sitting with something. Then Ruth Boyle, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, started clapping. Not the polite applause of ceremony, the real kind, steady and deliberate. Thomas Hartley joined her. Then Agnes Wheeler, who did not clap often and meant it when she did. Then others, then more, until the porch was vibrating slightly with it. Savannah stood and received it without raising her hands or smiling in the performed way of public figures. She just stood there, in her second-best dress with the flower stain on the sleeve, and let it happen. Cole was standing at the back of the crowd. She found his face without looking for it, the particular thing that happens between people who have lived alongside each other long enough that some part of them is always oriented toward the other. He was not clapping, he was just watching her, with his hands in his coat pockets, and an expression she had come to understand over the past month. The expression he wore when something had moved him past the point where his usual management of such things was possible, and he had simply surrendered to being moved. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, through the crowd and the cold air and everything that had been unspoken for 12 years, something passed that neither of them would have been able to name precisely, but that both of them understood. He nodded. Once. The way he nodded when something was settled. She turned back to the crowd. Spring came to Red Hollow the way spring always comes to Montana. Reluctantly, in pieces, the cold releasing its grip one grudging degree at a time, while the snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first and hung on in the hollows and the north sides of things for weeks longer than anywhere else. The creek thawed in late March, ran loud and brown for 10 days, then settled into itself. The aspen buds opened. The mud season came, thorough and inconvenient and welcome. Savannah walked the cellar in early April and stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time, looking at the shelves. They were not empty. She had not let them get empty. Had been restocking steadily since January, a little at a time, the way her mother had taught her. But they were significantly lower than they had been in November, and seeing them that way, seeing the evidence of the winter in the space where the jars had been, was a different kind of reckoning than the numbers in her ledger. She thought about Thomas Boyle, who was 8 now and had grown an inch since December and could be heard some mornings from the road, arguing cheerfully with his brothers. She thought about Margaret Caldwell, who had joined the kitchen committee and showed up every Thursday with a specificity of purpose that suggested her recovery had clarified something in her. She thought about Eli Dawson, who was officially apprenticed to Theodore Hale and had started walking differently. Not with arrogance, but with the particular posture of someone who has discovered a function in the world that fits them. She thought about Bernard Simmons and Cal Pruitt and Danny Marsh, and she let herself think about them without rushing past it, because she had learned over the winter that grief doesn't respond well to being managed and tends to collect interest if you defer it. She heard Cole's boots on the cellar stairs. He came down and stood beside her, looking at the same shelves. He had a crate in his hands, new jars. She could tell by the sound when he set it down, the particular ring of empty glass. "I picked these up at Henderson's," he said. "He had an oversupply." She looked at him. He looked at the shelves. "Going to be a long time before these are where you want them," he said. "Couple years maybe," she said. "Then we'd better start." He set the crate on the work table. He looked at her with the direct, unguarded expression he'd been wearing more often since January, the expression that cost him something and that he paid anyway. "Tell me what we need first." She looked at her husband in the lamplight of the cellar with the empty jar crate between them and the spring mud on his boots, and 12 years of accumulated not quite seeing each other, finally, imperfectly, honestly resolved into something that was not a fairy story and not a clean ending, but was real, which was, she had always believed, considerably better. "Elderberry," she said. "We're completely out." "Then elderberry first." He picked up the crate. "What else?" She picked up her notebook. She opened it to a new page. "Come upstairs," she said. "I'll make coffee and we'll write it down." They went upstairs into the April morning, into the house where the kitchen fire was already going and the light through the window had the new tentative quality of a season that is just beginning to believe in itself. And Savannah Brooks Mercer sat at her table with her pen and her husband across from her and started her list. Not because a crisis was coming, because she had learned from her mother and from the winter and from everything the winter had required her to be. That preparation is not anxiety and foresight is not fear. It is simply the decision to take the future seriously enough to show up for it before it arrives. Outside, Red Hollow was waking up. The kitchen would open in 2 hours. The committee met on Friday. The new jars needed filling. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She wrote the first item on the list and kept going.